afternoon. Thank you all for coming out on Oh no, I'm fine. I'm using my outdoor voice. I don't have to talk very long, so that helps. So I want to welcome you all to today's lecture. I'm Dr. Lee Ford. I'm the director of the School of Communication, and we are delighted that you're all here today. We look forward to an excellent lecture and then some dialogue afterwards. So thank you all for coming. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Annette Hamill, who will introduce our speaker for today.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for being here tonight. Tonight I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Laura Black, our 2019 visiting scholar. Laura is joining us from Ohio University in Athens, Ohio, where I did my PhD and she was my dissertation advisor. So we go way back. Dr. Black's research focuses on public dialogue, deliberation, and community engagement. She researches, writes, and teaches on topics such as civic engagement and discursive strategies for managing civil disagreement. She's also editor of the Journal of Public Deliberation, and she serves as chair of the Public Dialogue and Deliberation Division of the National Communication Association. Because of Laura's expertise in these important subject areas, we invited her to be our 2019 visiting scholar. This is a university-wide honor through WMU's Visiting Artists and Scholars program. Tonight's lecture is co-sponsored by the Ethics Center and the Cooley Center for Civil Discourse. Tonight's presentation is entitled Engaging Communities in Difficult Conversations, Dialogue, Deliberation, and Engaged Scholarship. Dr. Black will lead us in exploring topics relevant to all of us as students, researchers, teachers, citizens, and practitioners of communication who wish to live successfully in community with others. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Laura Black.
Thank you all very much. I have this mic here, so hopefully this works. Well, I want to thank Annette and thank everybody from the School of Communication for the beautiful visit today, and the Ethics Center and the Cooley Center for Civil Discourse. I really appreciate the sponsorship of this lecture and the ability to be here, and thank you all for coming to listen to this talk and engage in conversation about these important issues. So I'm going to spend some time today talking a little bit about what is public discourse and kind of where are we right now, what's going on, and then why does that make me nervous and anxious, and what are some things that I'm trying to do about it, right? So as I told Annette, I have notes over here. I may at some point come back to them, but I'll try to keep this engaging and lively. So I'm going to start with the question that I often pose to my students that makes them very unhappy. And the question is, and I'm going to ask you to sort of think about it. I won't, make you talk to a partner or write down anything or turn it down, but just to kind of consider it. Think about what it's like for you when you're talking about politics. And so what I mean by that is when you're talking about politics, when I talk about politics, who do I talk to? Where am I? What am I talking about? What's my goal, right? What is the conversation like? How do I feel? What's going on, right? So we think about that, and I see some smiles and some chuckles here in the front of the room. Yeah, I also get this face a lot from my students, right? When I ask this question, so I give them an alternative question if they don't feel like they can answer this. I never talk about politics because, right? And what I learned from this over years of asking this question is really consistent actually with the research we have on political discussion. First, a lot of the answers to this question of I never talk about politics are things like, I don't feel like I know enough, it's going to be stressful, I don't want to get in an argument with my grandma, it's not important, nobody listens to me, I can't make any sort of difference. So there's a lot of answers to this question that make me sad, right? But I understand and relate to. And then the answers to this first question when I talk about politics are really consistent with findings from political communication research. So people usually talk to folks who we think are going to agree with us. That's what we like to do. I know I talk about politics, I talk about it with my friends who I'm like, oh, can you believe this, that, and the other? They're like, I know, right? So this is kind of where we are. And this is our space, right? We have our bubble with the same ideas, the same opinions, we reinforce ourselves. And sometimes we need to do that, honestly. Sometimes we need that as a space. Or we tend to engage in the sort of yes-no oppositional kind of conversation, that political opinion change during these conversations is really rare. You know, the research that does the sort of pre and post and sort of surveys, conversation or political opinion change is really rare. Issues are treated as two-sided, and our opinions tend to sort of follow the party lines, right? The sort of oppositional way of thinking. So maybe this has been the case for a long time. Right now, though, it's really troubling. And here's part of why. Over the last 20 to 30 years, our mean political opinion, our average sort of political opinion for folks who identify as Democrats and Republicans, is getting further away from each other, right? And I see some nodding. Maybe this isn't too surprising. That, you know, our political discourses our ideologies are kind of pulling apart from each other. And when we look at what that means a little bit side by side, whereas in like 1994, maybe 64% of Republicans were more conservative than the median Democrat. Now we're at 92%. And for liberals, that's very similar, maybe even a little bigger. 70% used to be more radical than, you know, your average Republican. Now it is 95%, 94%, right? And this is 2014, right? That's all I'm going to say about that. And also, over time, our trust in our political leaders has gone down, and we're maybe a little happier when our guy's in office than we are when the other guy's in office. Our trust in each other to make political decisions and sound kind of judgment has gone down. And our information consumption habits reinforce this by giving us totally different sets of information, reinforcing our own sort of polarized opinion. So does this look familiar to anybody? Yeah, we can relate to this a little bit. Now, this doesn't mean this happens for everyone, but in general, this is a trend. And it leads us to moments like this. Maybe you can find yourself in this picture, where a family dinner at a holiday might require an umpire and maybe some political leaders who are pretending to play nice because we feel like we can't have a family conversation without feeling this kind of polarized position. Now again, these are sort of extremes, right? But we can relate to this a little bit. So there's a lot of folks who are very concerned about that, and I'm one of them, right? And so one of the reasons that I think this is particularly concerning is that it leads us to these stalemates. It makes it hard for us to move forward. It makes it hard for us to address problems in our communities that really need input from a variety of voices, not just the two perspectives that we polarize around or the loudest voices in the room, but to bring in a diversity of opinion and a wide range of difference, and to consider issues of power and gender and all kinds of things that need to be on the table and are often just stripped away. So I have these questions that guide my work, my academic work and my sort of community engaged work. The first sort of academic one is, how do groups discursively construct community and difference? So my research looks at how do we, through our communication, create a sense of things that bind us together and the differences that matter to us. What does that look like from a communication perspective? Similarly, how can communication enable and constrain our efforts to address difficult collective problems? I think there's a lot of answers to this question, but like, what does that look like? And how can we, as people who care about communication and community, how can we work effectively within that? And then how can communication design, so crafting particular formats or spaces for communication, how can that promote ethical decision making for diverse groups? And so my research has looked at these three kind of questions. I have trajectories in each of these areas, and I'm going to talk about one particular experience, but these sort of big picture questions are what's sort of behind my work, what guides my kind of research and activity. So when I think about community, central at this is this issue of community, because difference exists within a sense of community, right? That we have this kind of connection, and we have things that keep us help us understand how we are different from one another. But community is sometimes talked about as a place, right? The Kalamazoo community, the Athens community, right? The Michigan community, maybe. And it's also sometimes talked about as a group of people, but taking a communication perspective, we think about it as a set of meaning, right? So we have a shared sense of meaning about what it means for us to be part of a community. What are the symbols, the mutual influence, the pattern of human interaction that people take on shared meaning for members of a particular group. So ultimately, community is a social construction grounded in our everyday interactions, right? So this matters to me because it says to me that we can create a sense of community despite this polarization. In these sort of moments, in spaces, we can work to make this sort of community possible. So another concept I want to sort of bring to light and that I will talk about more specifically in my example is this idea of difficult collective problems. Sometimes people refer to these as wicked problems, as like the problem is wicked, the people aren't wicked, it's the problem itself, it's not a tame, sort of easily figured out problem, it's wicked. Sometimes people call them like sticky problems. But in our society and globally, we deal with very complex, difficult collective problems that need a lot of effort and sort of coordination and collaboration for us to address. So problems like climate change, problems like immigration and the sort of policies to address migration patterns, problems like the opioid addiction issues that I face or that we face in my community, water quality, all these sorts of things that are, gun violence in our communities, lots of these difficult collective problems that have multiple causes, multiple stakeholders, they're very complex socially, right? There are these competing values. Maybe you have values of both sort of freedom and sort of responsibility to others, right? That these values are in tension with each other in these sort of difficult problems. And there's no single straightforward solution. Any solution that we come up with is going to not sort of fix it forever, but will need to be readdressed and brought back together, right? So dialogue and deliberation are ways of dealing with these sort of difficult collective problems. So we have these collective problems, the processes we have for dealing with these problems are limited, right? We have things like public protest and we have public meetings, both of which are hugely important ways in which political action happens, right? Protests are hugely important for moving the needle on civil rights issues, climate change, all kinds of things that otherwise would not be taken action on if we didn't have the sort of protests kind of culture, right? And in public meetings, we elect officials, they represent us, they make decisions. Sometimes we get to watch. If we're really lucky, we might be like this gentleman at the bottom who gets to have his 2 minutes at the microphone, right? But these are both based on this kind of adversarial model, not based on this idea that we can collaborate. I mean, although policymaking ought to be collaborative, but as we are seeing, it tends to be very adversarial, right? So public dialogue and deliberation has emerged as sort of a field to bridge that gap. So not saying we shouldn't have protests, we shouldn't have policy making, but like how can we work in other ways to bring people together who aren't able to participate in this other system and build in more collaborative spaces. And so these are a bunch of organizations that do dialogue and deliberation work in the US and in other places. And they're efforts by nonprofit organizations, public leaders, city officials, and sometimes just like neighborhood community groups to create a different vision for communication. Right. So I'm going to talk very quickly about the theory. I only have 1 or 2 slides about the theory, so I'll be quick, but I think it's important to kind of understand the difference in those sort of terminology, right? So deliberation is a normative ideal, not meaning like this is normally what everyone does, but that it's an ideal to strive for. So it's a theory that is saying in a ethical world that's an ideal normative sense, this is what we would be doing, right? So it's this idea that decisions ought to be thoughtful, they ought to involve good reasons, and they ought to be inclusive of people who are impacted by those decisions, right? Early ideas were very focused at this sort of rational consensus idea, but that has some limitations, and feminist scholars came and said, that's not very inclusive of other ways of speaking, other ways of knowing that are really important. And so now contemporary deliberative theory involves emotion and a wider range of types of communication to be both kind of an analytic process and social process of equality and working towards models of democracy. public dialogue is a little bit less sort of rationally focused. The way that it's theorized and practiced tends to be more, still a normative model, but it tends to be more about these kind of emergent moments of open, kind of inclusive, respectful conversations where people are fully present and people are open to being moved. There's listening, there are possible transformations are possible through these sort of moments of dialogue. When it's applied to group practice, it has like really specific principles of how that is designed, right? So we have group facilitators and we have guidelines. We have all these sorts of things that help make dialogue or deliberation more possible, right? So how are these theories? These are communication theories, right? Political theories and communication theories. But how do they look in the world, right? What does this look like in a particular community? Well, there are a vast network of practitioners. This is one organization called the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation, which holds a conference every couple of years, but is just a network of practice, community of practice for folks who do this kind of work. And they really organize their work around these 4 different areas. I'm not going to go into a lot of depth about what all of these areas are, but some types of work are aimed at exploring ideas, their education. We're going to hold some sort of event in the community to try to explore what's really going on with fracking and water in our community. People are concerned about it. What is really the question? What are all the kind of possibilities that we need to understand? So it's not necessarily decision making, it's more of like a dialogue to try to be exploring ideas. Conflict transformation organizations who do this really are working from like a family therapy model or even like a conflict mediation to say, let's bring together folks from very polar opposite perspectives on an idea, on an issue, like maybe abortion or gun rights, or gay marriage and trans in the military, any sort of like very divisive issue, bringing together people who identify on the 2 sides of this and crafting a space that have rules that everybody agrees to in order to participate, not trying to make a decision, but just trying to build better understanding for each other, right? So those are thought of as like ways in which dialogue happens. 2 different models for the deliberation. The decision making is a little bit more like we have citizens who come together and they analyze an issue and maybe they're trying to make a decision in a community. Or collaborative action would say we're going to use principles of dialogue and then maybe some deliberation and we're going to add it into more of an activist orientation to affect change in our local community. So some of the organizations that do this say we have racial equity issues in our community. We're going to do these dialogues to try to build understanding. We're going to have deliberation about what are some different possibilities that we could have in actions in our community. And then over the next X number of months, we're going to work together to change the policies, right? So you can see it's used for these different sort of approaches, these different sort of models. Some common things in terms of the design. Unlike the public meetings, we have the 3 minutes and a microphone, or this space here. What is often the case for dialogue and deliberation is people are meeting together in small groups. They have trained facilitators. They have sort of these guidelines they agree to ahead of time about respecting each other, listening, even when you don't agree, that everybody has an opportunity to share their perspectives and everybody's perspectives are heard. And then you can engage with those perspectives, but no personal attacks. These sorts of things that people agree to participate. The structure, the processes tend to be pretty structured, right? To say, maybe we're going to first go around the circle and everybody has a chance, and then after that we'll do crosstalk, or these are the questions we're going to answer. They tend to be pretty tightly designed with, I think, the assumption that if that was not the case, we would just fall into our old habits of kind of polarized thinking. And there's attention to the material space in terms of what the rooms look like, what furniture is there, are there, papers that people can draw on, are there charts all over the walls, are people moving around, shifting groups, so all that kind of stuff. And I put this at the top, but I didn't mention it yet. There's also a really intentional recruitment that happens. Because with public meetings, a lot of times the folks who come to the public meetings are the people who either have the biggest stake and they really want to make sure their voices are heard, or they also tend to be the people who have a little more resources, a little more time, tend to be a little bit older, they tend to be more well-educated than the general population, they tend to be a little whiter than the general population, tend to be wealthier than the general population, right? So these kind of events are very focused on intentionally recruiting certain types of folks to bring diverse voices into the room together. A couple of ways that looks. Facilitators will do sort of these actions to try to guide the groups, right? In terms of guiding the process, asking questions, taking notes. But in terms of what the work looks like in communities, there are sort of these three different trajectories. One is the work that's called Minipublics. And so this work works really hard to get demographically representative sample of the population in the room for a certain amount of time to talk about an issue. So deliberative poll, it's like taking the super social scientific perspective toward how do we know we have the right people in the room. You might pay people, you might have a big NSF grant to like make sure people can participate in discussing this initiative that's gonna be on the ballot for like 4 days, and everybody in the room looks like a miniature version of the public of the state of Oregon, for example, right? And people are there for like 4 days and they get paid, it's really well structured. And so this mini-public has been a lot of work in deliberation, has used this sort of mini-public model. Right? Because the question is like, not what does the public think right now, but what would the public think if it actually had a chance to talk through the issues with lots of different kinds of people? Like, what would we think if we really actually thought about it instead of just what's my opinion off the top of my head, right? Another model is really this idea that we need to build deliberative systems, that even if we can't have this scientifically exact mini-public, that we need to spark little places where deliberation and dialogue are happening throughout our community and our media and everything, and build this sort of as a systems approach, understanding there's not going to be perfection in any one particular place, but as a system, we can become better than we were, right? And then there's also folks in communication scholars who look at this deliberation happening in what they call ordinary democracy. So Karen Tracy, Rob Azen, Kathy Kramer have all looked at how are our principles of deliberation and dialogue present in things like school board meetings and other examples of sort of everyday political talk. Right? So, summing up so far, and then I'm going to shift gears a little bit. I argue, along with a lot of folks who do this kind of work, that we need diverse perspectives to collaboratively address social problems. That's essential, that trusting the experts and relying on this sort of polarized discourse is really not going to work in the long run. It's very, it'll only get us so far. And if we really want to try to address these difficult collective problems, that we need to have collaboration across difference, right? Polarization makes that engagement really difficult, very challenging in the situation that we're in right now. But the good news, communication scholars can help, right? And I know a number of folks in this room who are communication scholars who do really engaged applied work with a variety of communities who are helping move the needle on some of these things, right? So dialogue and deliberation, I think, are one way to sort of do that. So what does that look like for me? I made a shift a few years ago to, instead of doing research about other people's data that they'd collected or studying events that other people were holding, I was going to shift and become more of a change agent in my local community. And I have. What I did is to really embrace the principles of engaged scholarship. So rather than going in and saying, I'm an academic, I know all these smart things, let me help you with your problem, person, and I can be extra smart. Can be Dr. Smarty Pants, as one of my grad students calls it. That my goal instead is to enter as a member of the community and say, how can I participate and build on the strengths that are here? What is it that I bring that's unique to my own skills, that is also complementary to the skills that other people in the community have? And then when it comes to a point where research is relevant, then we have conversations like, I'd like to write about this, and what might that look like, right? So it's coming in as a community member first, maybe an activist as well, and as a scholar, a little bit in the background. That's how I approached it. And engaged scholarship takes lots of different models, but that's been my approach. And so I had the opportunity to facilitate conversations about re-envisioning the facilities for our local public schools. And I'm going to talk through that example a little bit. And as you can see, we had some polarizing public discourse. Yes for success, no to the mega school, right? So, and I'll talk about what each of those mean a little bit. And this piece is coming out as a chapter in a forthcoming book about conflict transformation and peace building. So, I know that I've been surprised by how many people I've interacted with here know Athens, Ohio, right? So I don't take that as a given, but there are a number of folks who know Athens quite well. Dr. Warby comes there quite often, right? But I want to give you just a little bit of a picture of where we are. So this is where Athens is in the state of Ohio, right? Athens is beautiful, is it not? It's a gorgeous place. It's got hills and trees. The university is beautiful. It's a small town. You can walk most places. People are friendly. It's got a vibrant local food. Very awesome. It's just a great place. And people love it. Like nowhere I've ever lived do they love this location. They move away, they come back, they send their kids to go. There's a really strong commitment to place there, and it's because it's an amazing place, right? Not to say that Kalamazoo isn't amazing. Kalamazoo is also maybe amazing. I'm less familiar with it. Okay? So this is one picture of what Athens is like. So here's another picture. This is the voting results in the 2016 presidential election. And so we have blue areas here in all of the major cities in the state and in Athens County, right? So that's a little strange. It's this sort of blue dot, and it's a college town, all that stuff. A third picture of what Athens looks like. And this is poverty in Ohio by county, with blue being the best and red being the worst. That's, in terms of thinking about that. And you can see once again, oops, I skipped ahead. Once again, here's Athens, right? Athens has a poverty rate between 20 and 30% of people living in poverty in the county of Athens. And we're in this Appalachian region where that's not unusual. You can see our neighboring counties are similar, right? So I think that's really interesting to think about. If you're doing engaged scholarship and you're thinking about, I want to make a difference in my community, you have to understand the community, right? And for me, these aspects, the sort of beautiful place that people feel really committed to, the sort of left-leaning politics and incredible poverty are all really important aspects of the place. So when our schools had a need to revise the facilities, they had, this was sort of the situation. Enrollment's going down. This is true across the state of Ohio. I'm not sure if that's also true in Michigan. Reduced revenues to public schools in general. It's not the most well-funded thing going on. Our aging school facilities. We had incredible disparity between our schools, too. It's a small district. We have one high school in the district. We have one middle school that just feeds right into the high school. We have 4 elementary schools. There are no charter schools, no private schools, nothing else. Everybody goes to public school, or they do some sort of homeschooling thing, which there's a small population of people who do that, right? But this is it. This is our school district. And the schools, there were some schools that are much more wealthy, elementary schools, than others, and so there's disparity. There's one school that my kids went to, that I live near, that I was really excited about when I began this process, has the most international diversity, most sort of ethnic and cultural diversity. I didn't know this, but the lowest free and reduced lunch rate, the highest rated of gifted program kids, right? It's a very privileged school relative to the others in the area. A school 3 miles away has like a 75% free and reduced lunch rate, right? More special needs kids than any of the others. All these kinds of problems that are related to poverty, right? So what we had very much concern from the district. People were worried, the schools are going to close. Maybe they're going to lay off teachers. We're going to wear red to support our teachers. All sorts of rumors going on about what was going to happen to the schools. And the school board decided to create a steering committee to think about what the facilities could be like. And they had sort of this kind of straightforward vision of who should be on the steering committee and what it should do. But then they asked us to facilitate it. And they asked me and two of my partners. So this is Susan Urano, who's the executive director of our local community foundation. She's not an academic. She doesn't really like academics too much. She thinks they're kind of snobby. They're kind of a pain. And she really doesn't appreciate that they sometimes think they're smarter than everybody else and they use these words that nobody cares about, right? So she has a very low level of interest in the sort of academic world. And then Judy Millicent is a faculty member in public affairs. And the three of us have done a bunch of facilitating in our community, along with some other groups. And so the school board asked us to help craft and facilitate this change process. And these are the things that they've asked us to do, right? So we worked with them for about 6 months. We brought together, and I should look at my time to make sure I'm not going into too many details here. Okay, so they asked us to bring together people to have these sort of meetings and to have a proposal for the school board. And we designed it all around this sort of deliberative inquiry, which is from communication scholars Carcassonne and Sprain, who argue that it's not just a matter of getting public input, but it's actually knowledge creation. And all stages of this knowledge creation in the community should be oriented around dialogue and deliberation. So everything from bringing people together and convening to reporting to analyzing the data all needs to be done from this sort of spirit of deliberation and dialogue. So we had 16 members, and Susan and Judy and I pushed them to be more inclusive in who was invited to participate in this group. And we had representatives from each of the schools, we had teachers and so on. And the process was needed to be very open and transparent. So it's a public meeting, right? So where a lot of times dialogue and deliberation, you're doing kind of in a little bit more of a closed group where you can have a safe space for these difficult conversations. We were trying to do that, and we knew that there were members of the public sitting in the back watching all the time. And that the notes that I took as part of the meeting minutes, I joke that they were the thing that I've written that has been read by the most people and cited and used the most actively of anything I've ever written. Certainly academic articles didn't get read as scrutinized as closely as sort of the minutes I wrote from these meetings. But so we were doing these things to try to get the people to gather information. We provided a lot of experts to come and present information and get input from the community, to consider a wide range of possibilities, not to just go with whatever the first option was and promote it without thinking carefully, which is what happens sometimes. And they were really tasked with proposing a plan and giving it to the school board. That was their task. Okay, so a couple of things I want to share about this particular session. We had a website, as I said, it was very public. We had a website where we posted all the minutes. You can see there's the minutes from our process. This is still there, actually, if anybody's really bored and wants to look those up, you can find that stuff. And there were some pivotal moments in our process. We met every other week for 6 months, right? This is 16 people. And there were a few things that happened that, as a deliberation and dialogue scholar, I thought were really important to think through. First, it was stressful at first. People came in as stakeholders wanting to negotiate for their group. And we had to really work with them to try to say, we need to think a big picture. We need to think about what's good for the district as a whole. And of course, you should go and report back out to the people who, are bringing you here. But you cannot be entering this space thinking, I'm from East Elementary, and my job here is to argue for the best thing for East Elementary. Like, that can't be why we're here. It needs to be bigger than that. And that was a hard shift. And actually what ended up happening with that is they eventually got to a place where they all liked each other as a group, and they were really ticked at me, right? Because I was the one making them, do all this stuff here. And then we had an articulation of key values. And they ended up writing them out as, and this was like, we started thinking about what are this big picture, what do we care about for our schools, what do we want? And one of the biggest values that came from their group was this concern about equity. We want, our motto for the school is every learner, every day. We want, in addition to high quality education, we want to make sure that every kid has equal access to that high quality education. The kids aren't sorted into different opportunities because of things that they had no sort of ability to shift, right? We want this to be fair. And then we decided on options. And this was, after a couple of months of gathering information and sort of visioning and doing all this stuff, we had them break into these smaller groups and come up with these ideas for how they would configure the buildings. What would you want to have? And we actually ended up with like 7 or 8 different options, and then they all went off and they did these and they brought them back. We put them up all over the room and we talked about each one, and they eventually narrowed to 3 options. One that would put all the K through 5 kids in one single campus, different buildings, but like a single campus, so there was none of this segregation by neighborhood, right? One that brought kids together earlier, but had the grades, like we had one school just for kindergarten to 2nd grade, one from 3 to 5, one to 6th grade, etc. And then a third one that did have like 2 pre-K to 5 schools. Okay, so and this, it looks like okay, those are make sense, but it was hard fought to get to that point. And then we brought it into the community meeting. So I trained some of our steering committee members, people who've never really been part of public policy making ever. I trained them how to facilitate meetings. We held these big public meetings where hundreds of folks came, the high school, and then, after some kind of overview, we let people go into classrooms, and the steering committee members facilitated conversations. And most of those conversations were really great, and there were a couple of conversations that were really dominated by some people who very much didn't like our plans, thank you very much, and they had to make sure that we all knew why they didn't like their plans. So some of them, there was a lot of, it was very vibrant public discourse. Soon after that, no to mega school signs started popping up all over the place. And I got a lot of these in my neighborhood because the school that my kids went to was the most privileged school, right? And I kind of had to wrestle with my own privilege throughout this whole process and coming to terms with, equity means the school that's 1 block from me is going to be really different than it is now. I moved to this neighborhood because it was 1 block from that school. What does that mean for me and my neighborhood, right? So a lot of my neighbors had these no to mega school signs because they didn't want kids all in one campus. Even though nobody was proposing a mega school, there was no vote on the table. We were years from actually proposing anything that would go on the ballot. These signs went up, and people started asking me, Laura, when do we get to vote against the mega school? Did you hear they were building a mega school? So it was really this effort to kind of control public discourse as a resistance to this. Then the steering committee had to sort of negotiate which one they were going to put forward to the school board, and they eventually decided to put forward all 3 and let the school board decide because they wanted to agree as a group. They said, we've done everything by consensus. I don't want to now have to do a vote, right? I did a presentation to the school board. So I would say 2 of the main issues, there were value tensions that I saw in this work were related to community and equity. Now, in polarized discourse, we would see these things as opposites, and like some people are advocating for community and some people are advocating for equity. Just like I might be a Republican and somebody else might be a Democrat, and say we're against each other. But deliberative inquiry and public dialogue encourages us to see these values as related, as connected, as inherently needing each other, right? So although in the public discourse they were really presented as these opposites, in our conversations in the steering committee, we talked about how equity doesn't mean getting rid of a sense of community. People who are advocating for fairness and reducing disparities and cultural barriers to education also value the sense of connection among the students and teachers, right? People who want positive relationships and a local focus don't necessarily want unfairness and discrimination, right? And what was really challenging was in the public discourse, you get this, right? The no to mega schools, save our small schools, and the parents for equitable education. But in the deliberative discussions, we see these things as connected, right? So the last thing I want to sort of put forward before we kind of open to questions is a conversation about what I saw as the most hopeful from this discussion. And that is this idea that I'm advocating or sort of playing with of deliberative catalysts. And I'm going to give a few examples of that are in my notes that I haven't opened or looked at all during our talk today. But these were folks who engaged in the steering committee work in some way. So they were exposed to dialogue and deliberation through our work. And what I saw, because it's a very small town, and you can see people everywhere, right? It's like the town itself is maybe 15,000 people without the students, maybe smaller. I don't know. It's very small. We, everybody sees each other at the grocery store all the time, right? But these were folks who were taking what they had learned in the steering committee work and demonstrating some aspect of deliberation and dialogue in other spaces, right? So they were sharing high quality information or correcting misinformation, right? They were posing analytic questions rather than just posting opinions. They were listening across different ideas, and they were articulating values tensions, saying, I see community and equity in this work as kind of connected, and here's why, and promoting respectful interaction. So I'll give just a couple of quick examples. One, there was a Facebook group called Parents for Participation that originally was designed to complain about the number of snow days in the district that became this very vibrant public sphere because it was for parents from all over the district, not just associated with one neighborhood or school, right? So it was a place where people who had different perspectives on the issue were coming together to talk. And the folks who moderated this, one of them was on our steering committee, another one is someone who came and observed all of our meetings, right? It was public, right? The school committee, the steering committee was all public, we had an audience all the time. And they moderated these discussions, and I would see them, because I would lurk, I would see them posing questions, posing news, correcting misinformation, asking people, let's not have ad hominem attacks against the superintendent. Instead, can you talk about what your concern is more carefully? And I talked with them. They told me about how when things came up on the Facebook group that were like lightning rods, that they would sort of back channel talk to the person and say like, hey, this is kind of going on. Can you shift your discourse on it a little bit? Just as an example, somebody who may or may not be a friend of mine took one of he's a guy I know is a friend of mine, took one of these signs, a photo of one of these signs that says we love our small schools, crossed out the word small schools and wrote privilege and status quo, and just posted it on the Facebook group to try to get a rise out of people, right? Being part of the sort of call out, oh my gosh. And it just exploded, right? And so the moderators were folks who were saying, there's another way we can talk about this, right? Another one was a faculty member in education who had not really been very deeply involved, but had come to observe a lot of ours. And at one point he posed 2 identical posts to this group that said, this is just about a single campus school, right? I'm going to make another post about other things. But what are your, if you're against a single campus school, what are your concerns? If you're for a single campus school, what are your things that you like about it, right? And then he had an identical post about one of the other options, right? In order to sort of gauge this kind of conversation. We also had people who were on the steering committee who were, it's very much, these are folks, these are everyday folks who were suddenly in the public eye. And I would see them at the grocery store chatting with folks about this, or being at the high school football game, or being at the farmer's market, and engaging in these kinds of everyday conversations and presenting information. I think I could write a whole paper about like engaging in political leadership by walking my dog, because I have it's a very slow dog, right? So I have lots of time for conversation. But I think that this idea of deliberative catalysts as people who are boundary spanners in social networks, who can spark conversations from one sector to another sector, are really important, and that's what can help us move from these isolated sort of mini-publics to thinking more about a deliberative system. So just a couple things about implications before I wrap up for questions. I think that, if you're going to engage in this kind of work, which I hope you do, that careful design is really important. Thinking about who's in the room, what you're going to do, how often what room you're even going to be in, right? We had all this sort of community engagement that was at the actual elementary schools, had to make extra efforts to reach the populations of folks who otherwise were not going to be there. So those kinds of careful design is really essential. You need to have openness to feedback, which is hard, very hard. There's a lot of emotional labor that goes into that. And working with the articulation of key values. What is it that we value that's its intention here? What is it that helps us understand, not that we don't have differences, the differences are essentially important, but what is it also, the differences aren't everything, right? So what is it that we have in common, and what are the values in which we differ, where we can think through this together? But bringing those into the conversation rather than leaving them unsaid and assumed. I think this kind of work is very emotionally draining. It's emotionally demanding. And in my opinion, that was especially difficult in a small town, especially a small town that everybody loves. That during those 6 months, I was incredibly stressed out, and I felt like I had a target on my back. I felt like, there were all kinds of things that were very challenging. When the No to Mega School sign popped up, I was enraged, which I'm like pretty low key. I don't really get mad that much, but I was so mad. And so things like that, thinking about ways in which we engage in our own sort of emotional health is an important thing to consider if you're in doing this kind of work. And finally, I think the potential for participation to spread throughout a system by these people who span the different boundaries and engage in different groups should not be overlooked. That this kind of this catalyzing of deliberative conversation and public dialogue across a variety of places is very important and can help us build a deliberative system. And with that, I will wrap it up and say thank you very much, and I look forward to questions.
Any questions, anyone?
Yeah.
What originally got you inspired into a lot of this research? I know you covered a lot about being involved in your own community and stuff, and of course through argument of all of that field, but what personally kind of inspired you to take a leap into more of this role?
Yeah, well, it's really autobiographical. I think people come to this sort of work from a lot of different paths. My own personal path is I've had a long-standing interest in group dynamics and leadership and teams and sort of communication that happens in groups. And I mean, even when I was in college and like leading outdoorsy trips and making people go on ropes courses, like I had all of that was like my background, and that's how I sort of think about that we live our lives in groups, right? Families, schools, all this stuff, that the relational aspect of how we live together is important. And so that has been something that's gone with me throughout my work. And I think that communication studies as a discipline teaches people a lot that our society needs. That as communication scholars, we have skills and insights that can help make things better. And so, I mean, I want to do things that make the world better, and I can't affect the whole world. So the local-based work is helpful for me. But I think I shifted to being more kind of locally engaged when I felt like I really could make a difference in the place where I was. I'm very cognizant about, I lived in Athens for probably 7 years before I really tried to become a leader in that, because again, I didn't want to be Dr. Smarty Pants who comes in and says, I know all the things, here, let me give you some of these things I know, you peons of people, right? That's not how I wanted to enter in fellowship, right? Enter in collaboration, and so you gotta put in the time first. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So when you were going through the experience with the school and the polarization of some perspectives, right? So easy, and what we see now is people just kind of dig into that.
Yeah.
And they don't move, they just kind of dig into that. Have you seen movement from that piece of, and then how do you deal with some of those wounds that, like, oh, I didn't want to make a school and I got one, or
Right.
How do you move a community past that as well?
Yeah, and I think it's a long process, and it sort of ebbs and flows, right? So there were times in this process, and the process is ongoing, right? Like, we eventually got to a point where the school board made a decision about what they wanted to propose, and then did a lot of background work to put together a levy campaign, and there were vigorous pro and con levy sort of things, and it ended up passing. And so now but just barely. in a community that always passes its levies compared to our neighboring communities, right? Athens is like a liberal school where everybody, there's so much money that goes to the schools, especially compared to the other areas. And this one just barely, it passed by something like 600 votes, right? So we're moving forward on it, but it's still, there's definitely not consensus, right? But I think that having continuous opportunities for engagement and input across a wide range of populations has been really important. I think the superintendent has played a pivotal role in this, in that he has been someone who really wanted to do that capacity building and that sort of collaborative approach to change. But the healing is hard. But I think partially in a small town, in a community that has relationships, sometimes those relationships bind us together, even though we might disagree about the schools, we're still going to go to work together, right? We're still going to go to church together. We're still going to shop at the same grocery store. Our kids are still going to play soccer together. And so we end up having that relational connection that helps make the differences seem more like differences of opinion and less like, completely insurmountable differences. But it's not like it's not an easy, straightforward sort of thing. Yeah.
If a student had an interest in studying conflict resolution, is there a program at your school for that? And where are other programs that students could study and get skills in conflict resolution?
In conflict resolution specifically?
Yeah.
I think a lot of places you're thinking graduate programs, is that what you're asking about?
Master's level.
Master's level, okay. So Ohio, our master's program is not about that. We have a PhD program that would be more appropriate at Ohio University. The master's program is a little different. But I think that there are places like Penn State has a good program in deliberation and democracy. Colorado State University. There are a number of places that are active in sort of the public dialogue world. I don't have a list, but I could think about that some. But I think that a lot of times conflict is treated as kind of coming from an interpersonal communication lens, right? Thinking about conflict between romantic partners or friends, or from like an organizational, we're going to manage a conflict in the workplace. And what the public dialogue work does is to take that conflict and think about it in more of a intercultural conflict, more of a sort of a political sphere conflict in a public community context. So there are, I think University of Michigan has some things as well, but I would need to do a little digging to find a better answer to that question about programs.
One last question?
So do you go off and about and consult with organizations?
I've done a little bit of that. I've tried to stay kind of close to my home community because, but I have done a little bit of that, yeah.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, just one more very briefly.
Sure.
So in the small town, you're sort of all in this together, as you said.
Yeah.
You see each other, so that sort of means you gotta work through it.
Yeah, the social capital really keeps people kind of bound together whether we want it to or not, right? Yeah.
So how high up or how far does that extend? We're all in Athens together, we're all in Ohio together, we're all Americans, we're all global citizens.
Right.
How thin can we get that before it's like, yeah, I'm an American, but I'm an Ohioan?
Yeah, and you know what? I think that people probably don't have that. At least people in my community don't have like, I'm an Ohioan as a really strong identity label. But certainly, what you're asking about, that's a big deal, right? Because when we get to the level of sort of state or national or international politics, things need to bind us together that's not just the social capital, right? We need other mechanisms to make us feel committed to each other. And maybe those are commitment to higher ideals, maybe those are commitment to different sort of identity groups, or caring a lot about causes, or having kind of a sense of humanitarianism or something like that. But it's harder to make that sort of like, hey, we're all on the planet Earth together and we should all care so that we don't burn up and die, right? Like that gets heard as kind of like too abstract and maybe fanatic or something, So I think it does have to be, you have to have that connection on your communication strategy for building those connections has to be a little bit different. Yeah.
All right, thank you all for coming. And you are all invited to come upstairs and chat some more with Dr. Black if you'd like. We have a little bit of a nosh for you all. And again, right upstairs in the Clifford Center, so you're welcome to stop by. Please join me in thanking Dr. Black for a wonderful lecture and inspiring us today.